Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. Today is January 27th, which happens to be the birthday of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of the greatest composers of all time. It also is the day that Lyndon LaRouche was released from prison in 1994. And it's also the day that the prisoners at the Auschwitz concentration camp were liberated, and therefore is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And therefore, it is quite ironic that we have a situation where Germany, after saying never again, will be sending tanks to Ukraine to support a pro-Nazi Banderist regime in a war against Russia. And members of the German Bundestag have warned that this didn't work out so well 70 years ago. Explicitly, one member of the Alternative for Deutschland party said, we tried this 70 years ago. We sent tanks against Russia, and not too much later, we had Russian tanks in Berlin. It would be well for people to remember that. You had a member of the German parliament from the left part, the Linke Party, who actually came to the United States to speak in New York City at a rally for Julian Assange's release. She went so far as to say that the Liberal Party and the Green Party are the same as the neocons. And she spoke about Zbigniew Brzezinski and his clash of civilizations and the intention of the destruction of both Russia and Germany, which should be fairly obvious to the German population, given the Nord Stream pipeline's explosion, which almost certainly was done by the US and the UK, as admitted by Liz Truss and Tony Blinken, our foreign Secretary of State, in a text message. And then you had Victoria Nuland in testimony in front of the Congress yesterday, chortling about how pleased she was that the pipeline was now just a crumpled up piece of metal at the bottom of the ocean. Really pretty sick, if you ask me. So the tanks are not going to give some great advantage to the Ukrainians, especially since most of them are not going to arrive for several months, or in the case of the tanks from the US, up to 1 year. Scott Ritter was explaining that it takes 22 weeks to train someone on using a Bradley, just operating, not even operating with great skill or being adept at maintaining and repairing a Bradley tank. 22 weeks. Okay, so that's already 5 months or so. So this isn't going to help. In fact, as Ritter pointed out in an interview we did together today, since the Ukrainian Defense Secretary said at Ramstein that they needed 300 tanks, 500 artillery pieces, and a whole bunch of other stuff, of which they're getting on average about 20% of in several months. And if they didn't get it, they would lose. They, in effect, are admitting they're going to lose the war, contrary to the propaganda here about how Russia is losing. And Zelensky said that we need this by August. So that clearly is not happening. So they will lose, but for some dangerous, extraordinary intervention from the West. We know the West doesn't really care, and they don't seem to care how many Ukrainians' lives are sacrificed in this hideous meat grinder of a war, as long as it weakens Russia and hopefully destroys Germany as well. Then you have provocations now against China. The new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, is going to follow in Nancy Pelosi's footsteps with a visit to Taiwan. So extremely dangerous situation. However, it is becoming so extreme that I think the alliances on the side of NATO and the UK are fracturing. And I think we have to be aware at the same time that we must really organize no holds barred to prevent nuclear war, that there is a potential for an entirely new system to come into being. It's already started. And Americans, unfortunately, know very, very little, both about how China eradicated poverty most recently, which we discussed a little bit last week, or what actually happened in the United States in the Great Depression. And I think there's a reason why President Franklin Roosevelt was so horribly maligned and slandered, to prevent people from recognizing that there is absolutely no reason for people to be suffering from the kind of economic hardship that they are facing today. And it could be changed virtually overnight. We wouldn't have the infrastructure we need overnight. We wouldn't have the standard of living we need overnight, but we could move in a different direction very quickly. So I won't say more. I'm going to introduce a friend of mine, long-term LaRouche associate, economist Richard Freeman. He's written numerous articles for Executive Intelligence Review, and I'm really glad you're here to talk to us about how FDR got us out of the Depression.
Thanks, Diane. And I'm really glad to be here with you. In the period 1933 through 45, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt transformed an American economy that was collapsed by depression, whose banking system has fissured apart and was closed, and a good part of whose population had lost their savings, lost their jobs, had little or no food, who had lived through more than 3 years in which, since Black Friday of October 1929, the social cohesion of American society was tearing apart. At a time of intense crisis, Roosevelt changed the course of history. He saved the republic, and he saved the nation. First slide, please. So why study Roosevelt? Simply because he was a great president, which he was. We are on the verge of a collapse of the City of London Wall Street-centered financial institutions that will be 10 times greater than the serious crisis that Roosevelt faced. We can assimilate the most advanced ideas from Roosevelt and gain insights from his practice, and go even qualitatively beyond that with the principles of economist Lyndon LaRouche. Next slide, please. Now, this is LaRouche's famous triple curve or collapse function. And I just want to say one thing about it. I'm sure many of you have seen this more than a few times. It's an integrated function. As the financial aggregates, which are stocks, bonds, financial instruments, derivatives, grow, and each of them have a rate of return, that rate of return has to be taken from somewhere. And ultimately, all wealth is taken from the physical economy. So as those financial aggregates grow, they suck the lifeblood out of the physical economic input-output of the economy. So you can see the financial aggregates growing, and you can see the physical economic input-output, which is in orange, yellow, collapsing. Okay, and the financial aggregates are in red. Now, next slide. This is the financial aggregates done for the United States. I've omitted for the moment the monetary, which is the third one, which is the money supply, and just focused on the upper curve, and I put 2 representations for the lower curve. Now, I know it's difficult to read it. I will just say what it is. The upper curve shows the value, that's the blue, of U.S. debt and stock market valuation. It rose from $5 trillion in 1979. If you look at the lower left, that's where all these charts start, to $135 trillion today, which is an increase of 27 times. There are also 300 trillion derivatives outstanding in the U.S. banking system. So we're looking at a figure that's $435 trillion. Below that, you see 2 elements of the real economy. In the same 1979 to today period, steel production of the U.S. fell from 121 million tons, 125, and you can see that if you look at the grayish Middle graph that starts on the left, that's 125 million tons, and it ends at 89 million tons. So we've lost 28% of our steelmaking capacity. And the manufacturing labor force, which is represented in red, went from 19.4 million manufacturing workers, that's in the bottommost red curve, to 12.7 million workers, a collapse of 35%. So debt in stocks increased 27 times, while steel production collapses 28%, and the manufacturing workforce plunges by 35%. Next, please. We're going to add two graphs. The next curve shows the fertility rate of women of childbearing age, which is usually 15 to 44 years. And you will see that in 1960, women in childbearing age bore 3.6 children on average per woman who actually had children. 2.1 children per woman of childbearing age is the absolutely essential element, because you figure that maybe one child would die in birth. So the average would be 2.1 children are needed to just simply keep the United States at the same level. You'll see that the United States is now down to 1.67 children per woman of childbearing age. We are way below what we need to physically reproduce the American population. And you will see that it got worse from 2007 on. So that means Bush, Obama, Trump, and it's continuing. And the last one, please. Now, this is U.S. life expectancy. And in 2019, it was 78.8 years. In 2021, it was 76.1 years. This is the greatest two-year decline in life expectancy in 100 years. It's worse than what happened under Roosevelt. It wiped out, just these 2 years, 25 years of growth of life expectancy. So we can't reproduce our existence because of COVID, yes, which was a failure of a health system. Because of overdoses from fentanyl and cocaine, absolutely. But quite importantly, our living standard and productivity have collapsed, which most people don't dare to mention. That is driving this collapse, that and a cultural collapse where the value of having children is no longer seen important. Next, please. All of what I just showed you, back to the other one, please, is before the financial blowout that I just mentioned. All of that. Once this occurs and there's fascist slashing of production and living standards, even if we successfully organize to stop a nuclear war, which Diane spoke about, after such a financial blowout, we won't survive as a nation. We don't have it. And we're starting from this level and would be destroyed. Now, I don't mean this figuratively. I mean this literally. This is why we study Franklin Roosevelt. Next, please. Okay, that's out of order, but that's okay. Next, please. No. Next one, please. Yes, thank you. So, Roosevelt's great-great-grandfather was named Isaac Roosevelt. He was called Isaac the Patriot. He was painted by Gilbert Stuart, who also painted George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, which hang in the National Gallery of Art. And he had a central role in Roosevelt's life. Roosevelt studied his great-grandfather. His picture hung in the dining room, so when you came down, and you can still see it at Hyde Park, you have to pass it. He was a collaborator of Hamilton. He worked with Hamilton to pass the U.S. Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1787. He helped found the Bank of New York, which was the second bank in the United States after the Bank of North America, and he then, which Hamilton founded. And he then became the president of it. He was very close with Hamilton. He helped finance the American Revolution. Roosevelt knew a lot of this. Next, please. Now, this is a paper that you can't read, But it was either done, and I haven't been able to fully pin it down. Well, Roosevelt was a student, an undergraduate student at college, or after he got polio in 1921 at the age of 39. And in it, it's a paper, you can probably make that out, on Alexander Hamilton. He studied Hamilton. And he says in his short paper, and you can see the emendations and so forth, this is from the Roosevelt Research Library, that Hamilton founded the U.S. Constitution and prevented Aaron Burr from splitting it apart. That is a tremendous knowledge Roosevelt had throughout his whole life. Next, please. Okay, if we could back up, Jose, three, they're a little bit out of order, but that's fine. Back up to the banks. So, before that, please. And the one before that. Okay. So, Roosevelt enters the presidency on March 4th. That's when they used to swear people in 1933. They changed it to late January after a few years. Every single bank in the United States was closed. And you can see that just between 1930 and 32, you can see, the percent of banks that closed. Nationwide, it was 21.5%. So 1 out of every 5 banks closed then. And then the banking crisis got worse in 1933. Every stock market closed by March 4th, 1933, the day he took office. There was no effective financial system. Steel production was at only 26% of its 1929 levels. Industrial production had fallen by 37 and 54%. We don't know because of different sources. And 12.8 million workers were unemployed, representing a quarter of the workforce, but the level was much higher. It was easily a third. So what did Roosevelt do? Did he panic? Now, if we can go forward through the next couple ones. The next, please. Okay, so he gave his inaugural address. And so he says, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Now, a lot of people know that quote, which is good. It's an excellent quote. But let me go on what he said in his speech. He said, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness, and this is the Leibnizian conception of happiness, lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war. Next, please. And then he tells you how serious he is. I am prepared under my constitutional duty to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures or other such measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek, within my constitutional authority, to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. Now, let's go back to the previous one. because I think when you read this, you know what Roosevelt is saying when he says there's nothing to fear. Previous one. People had been destroyed. The fabric of the labor force was being destroyed for 3.5 years after the Mellon, Andrew Mellon destroyed, used it through the Hoover administration and through Coolidge. The first sentence should not just be read as an observation. He is an organizer, like we are. He's saying to them, people, if you have fear, you'll get nowhere. I know what we have to do. It's nameless, it's unreasoning, and he's trying to shift the mental outlook because unlike all the presidents preceding him, and many of them that have succeeded him, he had an idea. And he was very, very serious about the idea. Creative effort and work. Next, please. So after he was sworn in, let's go back to the other one for a second. He did a few things. Let me just tell you how he dealt with banking and credit. I'm going to be very brief on many of these topics, but I think we'll get some of the essentials. He is sworn in March 4th. On March 6th, 2 days after he took office, he declared a bank holiday. All banks, which were mostly closed, were further closed or by national decree. On March 9th, he got the Congress, the majority were Democrats, but Republicans as well, to pass the Emergency Banking Act, which we'll find out about. On March 12th, that's 3 days after the Emergency Banking Act, he explained the act in his first fireside chat on radio. Half of the nation listened to it, 60 million people out of 120 million people. He received millions of pieces of mail addressed to him, which was unprecedented because people wanted to tell him their story, and they felt that they could, just like people would say the same things to Lyndon LaRouche. On March 15th, this is only 6 days after he got the Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Act, he reopened the banks and money came in the banks. He then appointed a conservator who was to decide which banks could not be saved, which would have to be saved with government assistance, and which could stand on their own feet without government assistance. This was a form of bankruptcy organization. Of course, he didn't write off as much paper because the 3.5 years of the Depression had done that. But that's what he did. He then took the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had been set up under President Hoover, the previous president, to basically bail out the banks and to save railroad bonds because they were the largest industry in the United States. And he turned it into a Hamiltonian institution, like a First National Bank. Now, I want to make a point here. Hamilton in 1791 set up the First National Bank of the United States. Lincoln, during the 1861 through 65 Civil War, used the Treasury Department. Roosevelt took an institution and turned it into the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and turned it into a Hamiltonian institution. Therefore, it's not the form only, it's the principle. And the principle is you issue dirigistic credit in great quantity at inexpensive rates for productive purposes. And during the time that Roosevelt was in office, $9 billion of this money from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation financed the New Deal, which was roughly 1933 through 38. And another $24 billion, the mobilization for World War II. That's $33 billion, which in today's dollars would be gigantic. But the key thing is that was more than all the commercial banks collectively in the United States issued as credit. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, became the Hamiltonian bank driving. Next, please. Now, this is the Four Quarters Act, and what Roosevelt had done is he promoted this when he was running in 1932 for presidency when he was out in the Northwest. And what Roosevelt said is we can have 4 quarters of the United States. The first one in the Northeast, you'll see it's labeled St. Lawrence Power and Seaway Project. The second in the Southeast, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The third was the Boulder Dam and the Colorado River Project, which is in the Southwest. And the fourth, if you're following, is the Grand Coulee Dam, the Bonneville Dam, and the Columbia River Project. These touched 23 states. And he said, we're going to take these as pillars, and from them, we're going to develop inwards with other infrastructure projects to develop the United States. So, next, please. Now, this is from Lyndon LaRouche, and in an essay called The Gravity of Economic Intentions, Lyndon LaRouche stated the following. From this standpoint, the functional relationship of the noosphere to the biosphere is expressed chiefly as what macroeconomics views as basic economic infrastructure. This means chiefly the development of the land area of a national physical economy as an indivisible unit of action over a relatively long period of not less than approximately a quarter of a century, or even much longer. So if we can go back to the previous one, that was Roosevelt's conception. He doesn't have Lyndon LaRouche's full conception of anti-entropy and potential relative population density. But in that tradition of Hamilton and others, he sees taking the United States as a single unit of action. So he's not trying to improve Tennessee or Nevada. He does want to do that. He's trying to take projects which will treat the whole landmass as a unit of action in projects which may take 25 years. We're going to look at a few of those projects. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, the one that most people have heard about is the Tennessee Valley. Now, this is the Tennessee Valley watershed. You can see it starts in Virginia and has parts in North Carolina, flows southerly into Alabama, and of course through Tennessee, and then up northerly through Tennessee into Kentucky. And so it crosses 7 different states. You may not be able to read this, it's fine print, but you'll see, if you look to the sort of right of this, you'll see Norris. And then below that, you'll see Douglas. And then you'll see Fort Loudoun. And below that, you'll see Fontana. These are each of 23 dams that were built that transformed this whole region. And I want to mention this region, because of Confederacy and then Jim Crow and various what we called Negro Acts, which almost reinstituted parts of the Confederacy and so forth, we're like walking into a third world country. In parts of Tennessee, malaria was as prevalent as 33%. 50% of the population was illiterate. There were no hospitals in most of the counties. There was no electricity. So Roosevelt took a region, and what did he demonstrate? Next, please. Well, this is the Watts Bar Dam and Steam Electric Power Plant under construction. As I said, there were 23 dams that were built. But it just shows you the scale of what they were building. And this employed thousands, and the Tennessee Valley Authority employed tens and tens of thousands. You want to put people to work doing productive work, as he said in his address, his inaugural address. Next, please. Now, this gives you one feature, because what did they do? There was flooding, and various of the Tennessee estuaries and tributaries would flood. So they would take off the topsoil, rendering agriculture useless. They would also flood entire regions and wipe out towns and cities. They would also, at the same time through the flooding, make it impossible to have downtown industries. So I want to just show you one picture which I think captures a lot of this. This is of Chattanooga, Tennessee. One of my good friends is from there. And you will see in 1867, which is on the left, after the flooding of the Tennessee River inundated the entire city of Chattanooga. You cannot see it. That's on the left, topmost left. Now look on the right. After the Tennessee Valley put in the control of rivers, contouring of land, and so forth. The Tennessee Valley Authority also put into effect 15,000 farm projects. So farmers would come all over from different parts of the country to see how they use tractors, to see how they use fertilizers. Next, please. This is Tennessee Valley Authority Chairman David Lilienthal, who wrote in 1944, "Impossible things can be done and are being done in this mid-20th century." Diane Sayer, who knows a lot about Lilienthal, is going to speak about him after I finish speaking. Next, please. Now, this is how a hydroelectric dam works. I just want to show it to you. You can see that there's a reservoir, which is built up behind the dam, and then there's a penstock. And the penstock takes water from the reservoir. It takes it to a turbine. The turbine turns very, very rapidly. That turns an armature in an electric field, which is your generator above that. And that generator generates electricity, which is then sent long distance for wherever it's needed. And this was done on most of the dams in Tennessee. Now, to build this, I just want to say they had to excavate 30 million cubic yards of rock and so forth and so on. Some of the dams were built around the clock. They built with wood because they didn't have steel. It was going into the war effort. But just to give you two parameters, in 1933, there was little power generated in the region. By 1939, the TVA generated 2 billion kilowatt hours. By 1945, it generated 12 billion kilowatt hours, a further six-fold increase. Today, it generates 166 billion kilowatt hours. Tennessee and other states used to have far below, about 40% below, the average electricity use of other states. They now have about 1.3, 1.4 times the use. Their electricity went down to 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And the entire composition was changed. Before Roosevelt did this, there was about one manufacturing worker for every farmer. By the 1960s, it was 3 manufacturing workers for every farmer. They took an entire region and transformed it. And that's why China sent people during the war over to meet with David Lilienthal and others. And they worked out the plans for the Three Gorges Dam in China, but also plans for Jordan, plans for many, many areas around the world, because this was a model of what could be done and could be done again today. And we need it in several places. Next, please. So now I'm going to look at the other quarters very quickly. This is the Colorado River Basin. You can see it comes down from the Colorado River from Canada, and it's part of Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and a little bit of New Mexico. Next, please. So I guess we're going to the Hoover Dam next, so I'll skip that. We'll come back to it. So this is the Hoover Dam. So this is the southwest quadrant of the go to the next one. It probably has the northwest quadrant, if you could. Yeah. So you'll see that that's the northwest quadrant of the 4 quarters. And this is what Roosevelt had conceived while he was running for president. This was not like something slapped together. And they built there the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville River Dam. And this fertilized entire areas, eliminated flooding, produced electricity, so much so that the area of the Columbia River and the area of the Tennessee Valley, Hannah Ford in that region of the upper quadrant, northwest quadrant, and in Tennessee, Oak Ridge, became the centers for both building aluminum plants, which use a lot of electricity, and they were also the centers for nuclear power development. Okay, next, please. Now we're going to go back to the Hoover Dam. Oh, and there's the beautiful Grand Coulee Dam. I mean, these are magnificent structures. If you've never gone to visit a dam in your life, get in your car, find one. They're beautiful, and they'll take you down into the generating stations and things like that. Next, please. Okay, if we could back up just once before we get to the St. Lawrence Seaway, to the one that had the Hoover Dam. So thank you very much for being patient. Okay, so this is the Hoover Dam. Now that's in the southwest. And this dam, which was for half a century the highest dam in the world, took the water of the Colorado River and it irrigated the area in California, which was desert. It's called the Imperial Valley. and it turned it into the vegetable and fruit growing region of the United States. And it did it through a canal, which was called the All America Canal, which was also built by Roosevelt and these various agencies. Next, please. Now, the last of the four quarters was one that was dear to Roosevelt's heart. Next one, please. Next, please. This was the St. Lawrence Seaway, so this is the Northeast. And Roosevelt had been supporting this to develop the St. Lawrence Seaway and tap the Niagara Falls or other areas that had these tremendous falls along the St. Lawrence Seaway, which would go right into Lake Erie and then Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and would connect to the entire inland United States water system. He started working in this in 1912, and then when he was governor of New York from 1928 through 1930 and 1930 through 1932, he would complete his work at night, and then he would work on this. And he also tried to figure out, which he did with an assistance of Morris, Llewellyn, and Cook, how much it really cost to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity, so he could break the trusts that were controlling electricity. Now, this required a treaty with Canada, and therefore could not be done until the 1950s. But this was dear to the heart of Roosevelt. So those are his four quarters. Okay, next, please. Okay, he also developed the Mississippi River. Some people are not as familiar with the Mississippi. It starts in Minneapolis and goes all the way down southward to New Orleans. Next, please. And you'll see here a levee system, which are walls made of earthen walls reinforced with concrete in many cases, to stop the tremendous flooding of the Mississippi River and make the river navigable for both people, above all for transportation, also control flood control, and so forth like that. That was done by the Army Corps of Engineers. Next, please. Now, what Roosevelt did is he created some agencies. One agency he created was called the Public Works Administration, which built large projects. That was under Interior Secretary Howard Ickes. He also built the Works Progress Administration under Harry Hopkins, who was very, very close with. And they built gigantic projects to the United States. I want you to get a sweep of what Roosevelt was doing and what we can and should do today. So this is the construction of hydroelectric. And you saw some of the hydroelectric plants, but you can see that there are many other states. This is about 50 plants and projects. Okay, that's one project. This is all just strictly the Public Works Administration under Ickes. They were financed in whole or in part with PWA. That's what they call funds. Next, please. Okay, now this is allotment for electric power projects, not for dams. And you can see the whole Midwest. Look at the Dakotas. Look at Iowa. Look at Ohio, which is next to Pennsylvania and Indiana. You'll see how many public electric projects. But also look at Texas. Look at Alabama, Mississippi. Many of the people who rail against Roosevelt, their states were developed so they could survive to rail against Roosevelt because he built these projects in their states with the cooperation of people who wanted to develop America. Next, please. These are all Public Works Administration projects. Next, please. Okay, this is waterworks. Basic, fundamental, putting in clean water. Look at the density of these projects. And people often say, well, Roosevelt just built make-work projects. Did these look like make-work projects? These are the water systems. Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi, doesn't have clean water. And they still don't have it because they're not being allocated the most necessary funds. This is in 2023. This is some of the things we would need to build, but this is what Roosevelt built through the Public Works Administration. Next, please. This is education buildings, because during the Depression, they didn't have the money. The states and counties, which are the ones that usually build it, counties, they didn't have the money. So Roosevelt built education buildings. The graph is not so clear because there's so many of these projects. They paid for the teachers in Massachusetts. The PWA paid for the teachers in California, especially after an earthquake in Oakland. Next, please. Okay, These are the hospitals that were built. And this is where Hill-Burton gets its roots, this in the US military. But look at the number of hospitals, because they did a survey in 1939, comprehensive, and said there are counties after counties after counties where there's no hospitals. So we're going to start building hospitals. Should we do that today? Look what happened with COVID, where we didn't have hospital beds, nor the equipment, nor the staffing. Of course, we should do this today. Next, please. And this is sewage disposal. Again, very fundamental. They reversed part of the Chicago River. I mean, these were big projects so that they could actually stop the flow of it being reversed and go straight where it should. And they built a huge sewage treatment plant, the largest in the world, all under Roosevelt. Next, please. Now, what Roosevelt then did, this is just one of the features. He also used the rural electrification project, which was under Morris Llewellyn Cook, which was supported by George Norris of Nebraska, who was also very big in building the TVA. And Nebraska doesn't touch any of the TVA projects on the Tennessee River, which shows you that in those days, people didn't say, it's my state. That's all I talk about. You know, I can only talk about, you know, like Gillibrand. I only talk about New York matters. Well, here's George Norris in Nebraska sponsoring most of the work for building the rural electrification. In 1933, less than 13% of American farms had electricity. And in Mississippi, it was 3% and so forth. Through the rural electrification program, which strung electricity lines where the monopolies would not go, they electrified the farms. This continued into the 1950s, where you can see it reaches 80%. That brought electric machinery to the farms. It brought washing machines, electric lights, refrigerators to refrigerate. Think of a modern farm today. How could you run a milk farm without having refrigeration? But this was done by Roosevelt. Next, please. Now, the last thing on this point is that this had a multiplier effect. If you build physical infrastructure, and I have only touched on that side, there's much, much, much more that he did. He built 55,000 infrastructure projects in 12 years. 55,000. Look in 1934. What percent of all bricks and hollow tile were used for just the Public Works Administration? I'm not talking about the CCCs, which is another extraordinarily important program, and the Works Progress Administration. So 23.5% of all cement, 73.6, almost 3/4 of all cement in the United States went to these projects. 40% roughly of structural and reinforcing steel and sand and gravel. That means that if you build something, you have to provide cement and steel and piping and so forth. That multiplied the number of jobs. Next, please. That's Harry Hopkins, who headed the Works Progress Administration, who put people to work. And then Roosevelt used him during World War II to help do the diplomacy that he needed. I did some calculations just using figures from the Public Works Administration. At their peak years, 34, 35, 36, they employed, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCCs, which were magnificent, they employed 3.1 million workers. By using their statistics, it was clear that they employed more workers, or an equal number of workers, in the industries that I just mentioned. And not just those industries, not just tile and cement and so forth. But if you build a public works project, you need earth moving equipment, you need tractors, you need cranes, you need transmission lines. And by just looking at the records which they kept of who they employed and what they paid them and what they were for, the jobs, it was clear that they produced 1.85 jobs in private industry for every one job in public works. But I just conservatively said it was 1-to-1. So if there was 3.1 million jobs created in public works, there was 3.1 million jobs created in the private industry. That's underestimating what they said, but I thought it was the best thing to do. That's 6.2 million jobs. But if you do that, you get people opening stores. You get people selling houses. They call this a secondary effect. And I estimated that very, very casually at only 0.9 million or 900,000. So if you take the together, they created 7.1 million jobs. That's 1/10 of the American workforce in those years. That's what public works does. That's what Lyndon LaRouche was saying, that you think of this as a unit, the whole land as a unit, and then you raise potential relative population density in all areas. Next, please. Kainan or Jose. Next, please. Okay. Yeah, so those are some of the people who did work, but back up 1 second. The previous one slide. Nope, it's in between. So one after this. Okay, this is a speech. Maybe I put the other one in there just to show you some of the workers. Now, this is a speech that Roosevelt gave in 1936, because I'm just going to mention very, very quickly, and I'll tell you where you can get information on this. But what Roosevelt did in many, many other spheres. But this is his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention when he was renominated to be president. And think of all the banal, terrible, and offensive and warmongering speeches that you hear each president give at the end of January to their State of the Nation or when they're accepted. But this is what Roosevelt said. His acceptance speech. Charity, in the true spirit of that grand old word. For charity, literally translated from the original, means love. The love that understands, that does not merely share the wealth of the giver, but in true sympathy and wisdom helps men to help themselves. Next slide, which is part of this. Governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes. But the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in the spirit of charity, love, than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. And that motivated Roosevelt. So I will just say, Roosevelt introduced Social Security, passed it through law. Unemployment insurance, passed it through law. Put through various help to the aged, passed it into law. And a whole series of things that you take for granted in your life. He saw to it with people in Congress, like-minded people in Congress, that they were passed into law. On the question of racial inequality, he supported the efforts of Senator Robert Wagner from New York, a much better example of who a senator should be than either Schumer or Gillibrand. Anti-lynching laws. He, on the Public Works project, said that African Americans and whites would be paid the same scale. And this was under the initiation of some of the people in his administration, but he completely supported it. This rose complete holy hell. Because what Roosevelt was doing in the South was taking on directly the whole era of Jim Crow. So that was his idea of charity. Okay, next, please. Okay, and I just want to sum this up because I just want to say a few minutes, if I can, Diane, if there's enough time, just on the war mobilization, which I'll make very quick. But this is another quote from Lynn, and this tells you what the war mobilization was. Lynn said, this is in December 26, 1999, called Tinseltown Follies. But this was part of his presidential 2004 presidential campaign. He said, typical of the investment practice, which yields the highest rates of growth of physical productivity per capita and per square kilometer, is a so-called science-driven crash program effort, such as the U.S. Manhattan Project, which was under Roosevelt, and the German-American aerospace effort launched under President John F. Kennedy, which we've spoken about quite a bit. This requires the kind of society in which each young person is educated in the way coherent with that practice of knowing. That means, in turn, a family and a cultural environment coherent with the production of such qualities of graduates of education. It means a society whose investment policies cohere with that kind of emphasis upon fostering crash program-like rates of improvement in the physical productive powers of labor. Next, please. So I'm just going to go through the World War II literally in 6 minutes. So this is the arsenal of democracy, building an engine. Next, please. This, I think, is tremendous. It's not only just a Rosie the Riveter, but it's a woman doing sophisticated work with drill bits and so forth. Next, please. What Roosevelt knew when we got into World War II is that we needed to produce machine tools. So I'm just going to have you look at the fact that in 1933, we produced 30,000 machine tools. If you look at the solid line, by 1942, we were producing over 300,000 machine tools. Next, please. Can you hear me? It's soft. Okay, this is airline output. Now, airplane. This was military and civilian. In 1940, Roosevelt said, I'm going to build 50,000 planes, 1940, late 41, 50,000 planes over 3 years. People attacked him as being absolutely not having any idea of what he was talking about, can't be done, and so forth. You will see that in 1944 alone, we produced 96,000 planes. Next, please. Now, this is industrial growth and output, and I will only say that radar, nuclear power, magnesium, aluminum, many of the other things, our use of sulfur as a drug, are all products of World War II. And you can see the production index, 1939 through 44, it more than doubles. With 1967 said it's 100, goes from 21.7 to 47.4, and in 45 there was a demobilization. This is the economy more than doubled, but it used the New Deal, electricity and everything else, and then built a new economy of high technology where social surplus was reinvested at the highest rates possible. It was driven by that. Next, please. This just shows you that the unemployment, which was 9.5 million or 9.48 million, went down to 0.67 million. Now, most people say that's because people were just put into the army, but it's not. Look at the manufacturing labor force. It goes from roughly 10.3 million in 39 to 17.6 million, a 70% increase in 1943. They were being assimilated, and many of these were black workers from the South, from Alabama and elsewhere, who went to Chicago, who went to Detroit, and that began the real integration of the labor force. Next, please. Now, profits and wages. You'll notice that the average annual wage doubled, but profits quadrupled. And people say, well, you can't do that. There's a clash between labor and capital. Well, both grow if you make them grow. Next, please. Okay, back to the other one. Now, the point I would just conclude with is this. What's military production? Well, military production, from the standpoint of an economy, is useless. From the standpoint of world strategic affairs, if you look at what NATO's doing and so forth, which Diane went through in the beginning, it's worse than useless. It's bringing us on the verge of nuclear war and the extinction of the human race, as Stephen Starr has shown us. However, if you have a science driver, could not we take that science driver and put it to building 100 nuclear power plants? Could not we build the North American Water Power Alliance? Couldn't we build what Hal Cooper, and I worked with him on this, 42,000 miles of high-speed rail and most increasingly maglev? Could not we build the water system so that we don't have floods in California, which we know has heavy rain certain times and drought the other times? It's not like it's not known. If you take this mobilization, where Roosevelt reached into the inner soul of the American and pulled out his better half and said, we're going to do this for the nation. What would that do for morality? If you want to make our nation sane, if you want to stop seeing these insane pictures of people walking into Walmarts and other places and shooting up people and killing them, you can try dealing with one by one. But as Lyndon LaRouche said, you make people sane on the whole, not everyone, by making the economy and the world and the economy moral. And if you make it moral in the sense of charity, you will make it sane. So the last slide, just very quickly, this I was done quickly, but there was a 3-part series, which was in the April 26, 2002 EIR, and then May 3rd, May 10th. So if you want more information, you could look. But in any event, I think this is a spearhead of what, when we have a blowout, within the context of an international new security architecture, it has to be, we can do.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rich. There's all kinds of comments in the chat. I want to ask you a couple of questions, but I just want to share a little story that someone posted in YouTube, who writes, "My dad joined the CCC and built canals all over the state of Utah during Roosevelt administration, then lost his leg in World War II." And then someone said, "I'm sorry to hear that." And then he said, "Well, thanks." But then he came home and raised 7 children and worked the rest of his fairly long life. I mean, what a difference from pessimism to optimism. Now, we're getting some of the typical questions, and I'd like you to just go ahead, because this comes up all the time, about FDR taking people's gold away. And wasn't that illegal? And didn't he take illegal powers? So would you care to address that?
Sure. What Roosevelt did is this: you have to establish sovereignty of the credit system. And as I said, he had a credit system, and we're going to do a part 2 of this, which will deal with his new Bretton Woods, but can't for another few weeks down the line, but we'll do it. In the credit system, the problem was that the British could always use gold. The dollar was pegged to gold. Pound was pegged to gold until 1931, and when they went off the gold standard in September under Ramsay MacDonald. The problem was the United States, if it was pegged to gold, could not redeem dollars. Someone brings in the dollar, and the Treasury has, or the Fed, whichever, depended on the circumstance, pay out gold, because there was a flood of gold leaving. And there was a conference in 1933 where he sent Max Warburg over to it. And it was a British-controlled conference, and they made very clear, since they controlled the gold standard, which was deflationary. It's not a gold reserve system. Gold reserve system uses the gold and other reserves, which is much more expansive. This is a completely deflationary system. And the British were going to return to that, and they were going to use it against the United States and the rest of the world. And he said, look, we're not going to do that. We're taking the dollar off the gold reserve system. The British did it. And we're not going to allow people to do what they were doing with Bitcoin today, which is to introduce another sovereign currency or something as a substitute to that. We're not going to do it. We've got to get credit where it belongs. And the banks were still very active, trying to sabotage everything Roosevelt did. There was an assassination attempt on Roosevelt in 1933 before he became president. There was a coup attempt by a group of people, which William Smedley Butler exposed in 34, 35, to use people like the American Liberty League to overthrow him, which were the Morgans and the DuPont. He knew how volatile it was. He saw fascism go up in Germany. So he said, no, we're going to control our own sovereign currency. I'm going to say gold is no longer monetized. And if people want to use it in a way that's harmful to the country, I'm simply going to say we will take it away. It was not a hatred of gold, because the gold reserve system mirrors in Bretton Woods, but it was a recognition that you have to have sovereignty if you're going to have a country.
Okay, we'll see if that's satisfactory. What I just wanted to say is that all of this demonstrates that there's no need. I mean, it's what FDR said in another of these speeches, or I guess it was the first inaugural: we haven't been stricken by a plague of locusts. In other words, the economy is man-made. It is not a natural phenomenon like an earthquake or something over which we have no control. And therefore, what people are experiencing, the banksters, the too big to jail and fail bankers, would have you believe that they are something like the gods of Olympus, and these are the laws of the market and the laws of supply and demand, and therefore we have to put everything under that's just complete crap. And we could decide at any moment to put the entire system through a kind of orderly bankruptcy reorganization process, like what FDR did during the bank holiday, except on a much greater scale. And I don't know if you would like to say something about that, because it really makes me angry to see how people are living and suffering in the United States in a way that is totally unnecessary.
I totally agree with you, Diane. Look, his attack was on fear and stupidity, which look, what are we dealing with today? Why do people who see that there is a Nazi regime in Kiev, and you have these, I saw the other day someone who's hunting down 85-year-old to 90-year-old Germans who served at Auschwitz, who committed crimes, and you have Nazis in Kiev and they won't hunt them down. What's going on? The thing is, Roosevelt could see this and he dealt with it. And I would take your point even one step further. It's a psychological state. If you have a fool like Gillibrand, like Biden, and unfortunately Trump has a certain spirit, but his economics is very poor, they don't have a sense of, I'm going to mobilize the nation. Look at Roosevelt's first words to the nation. You have nothing to fear but fear itself. There's creative joy in work, and I'm going to use emergency powers, if necessary, to get these programs through. When have you last heard a president like that? The only president I can remember in any significant form was John F. Kennedy. It's a psychological state. It's exactly what Diane is saying. Once you can shift people's psychological state and then give them a mission and define that mission, and multiple missions, but all cohering on anti-anthropic growth, then you will change the outlook. And as for the second part, look, what was the worth of the bankers in 1933 after people suffered through 3.5 years of their policies, which had destroyed the United States? They, the academics, all the authorities, all the people at the universities were discredited. And in that situation, a determined force which speaks reason and truth and has this conception of agape or charity, but is determined that they can do this, like we're doing right now with a new security architecture and new Bretton Woods. They are the seeing in the land of the one-eyed giants. They have the vision. And if you have that vision and you have the compassion for the human being, as he said, Dante, thinks that divine justice errs on the side of those who most need it, then you will succeed. But it's exactly correct. It's stupidity and fear. If we can overcome that, this could be done in a matter of days or weeks, at least initiating it. The work will take a quarter of a century, some of it.
I think that problem of stupidity and fear causes many people to be somewhat pessimistic.
Yeah.
But
They will never let us do it. They are not going to be in charge. They are idiots, and people see that. If you don't think people think some of the... Anyway, sorry.
No, and I would like to just underscore that optimism comes from fighting. That is, the reason why you're optimistic is because you know that you are not going to capitulate and you will never give up. If you decide to give up, then you become pessimistic. And I will say you have develop all kinds of health problems if you decide to be pessimistic, if you don't fight. All kinds of stress-related illnesses, ulcers and hypertension and obesity and so on. You could be much more healthy if you would have the courage to stand up and fight this, even if you do get arrested or put on a Ukrainian Nazi kill list.
Yes, and look, it's something that Lynn always emphasized. You don't know something until you poke it with a stick, but more importantly, you don't know the American population until you try to organize it. And I would take this message to do, because we've had Kynan and Jose working on this, do what they're doing. You need to, you find the strength that you didn't think you had. Just like the American population discovered the strength during World War II. It wasn't that we went up by 5% or 10%. We went up by leaps and bounds. In fact, it's like a bird. Until you soar, you never know what potential you have inside of yourself. And that's an intellectual and moral commitment and a compassionate commitment. But you fight like a tiger, like Diane does. You have to have all of those things, and Helga. But you have to exercise it. If you don't exercise it, it's like it's wasted. It's like it never existed. And I remember Frederick Douglass, the great American, said, you know, after he learned to read it, what a liberating feature it was. But he said, if you don't use that power, it's like you didn't have it.
Exactly. Exactly. So I just would like to announce some upcoming activities and events. On Saturday, February 4th, the Schiller Institute will be holding a day-long conference, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said must be dedicated 2/3 to the solutions, 1/3 to the problem. Very important, because I do think that this situation is, as I said at the beginning, is so extreme that there's going to be all kinds of splintering and factions. Will NATO fall apart? Will the EU fall apart? I don't know. But how stupid are people? Do they want to continue to be in these institutions? I'm not sure. Meanwhile, there's an entirely new paradigm coming into being. What is their policy? The BRICS Plus, what is their policy? So it's very, very important that people, I would study what Rich just went through with us to get a sense. I mean, I was blown away. I wrote down 55,000 infrastructure projects in 12 years. It was a big deal when President Trump came in and he had a book of about 40 projects, none of which got done, and he was pressed or somehow fired the guy who came up with the proposals. Now we have this Inflation Reduction Act, which names a bunch of projects, including some water management projects in Queens, which are badly needed, except it doesn't provide the funding. So we have proposed projects, none of which will be built. I mean, I would ask people to think of that, 55,000 projects in 12 years. Who says we can't address this? And then February 19th, so we have February 4th on the Schiller Institute, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and then 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. It's an all-day conference. On the 19th will be a rally in Washington, D.C. That's President's Day weekend, called Rage Against the War Machine. I am scheduled to speak there along with Scott Ritter, Jimmy Dore, Garland Nixon, Tara Reid, many people who many of you are familiar with. And there are efforts being run by the FBI and others to pull that thing apart right now by getting everyone to freak out about everyone's differences, as if we didn't all know our differences, or by spreading vile slanders. It sort of reminds me of the stories going into the first Iraq war in 1990, I guess it was, about the Iraqis pulling babies out of incubators. And I mean, we've seen this so many times. So-and-so has 7 heads. Why would you work with them? Well, maybe the threat of nuclear war is so great that I don't care if someone has 7 heads. If they're willing to act to stop nuclear war, then we're going to collaborate on this, and we'll worry about doing something about the extra heads after we all survive. So that's the 19th at the Lincoln Memorial at 12:30 in the afternoon. If you're interested in going, I'm considering looking into chartering some buses or other things, so please send an email through my website, sarahforsenate.com. Also, I would like to encourage everybody to donate. My campaign against Gillibrand happily is picking up where the Schumer campaign left off, not at ground zero again. So today I did 3 interviews before this program tonight. The pace is somewhat breathtaking. And I need the resources to keep moving at this pace. So SareForSenate.com, and you can donate on the website. But that's what I would urge people to do, is to join us. So that's what I have. Rich, are there any things you'd like to say in closing?
One thing that, when you were speaking, made me think of this is that, we should build 12 to 25 entirely new cities, many of them in the Southwest. Why stop? It's almost like people think, well, we built all this stuff. We have so much to do. They would require not only the water and everything else, that would probably employ about, I would estimate, 1 to 2 million people in all the different phases. There are so many things that America needs right now, and it's this method of both thinking and morality that can get it done. So that's it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We'll see you again soon, and I hope to see everyone else here next Friday, and then on Saturday the 4th, and then in DC on the 19th.